Hello, everybody. It's Wednesday, October the 15th, 2025. The world economy seems in a state of uncertainty. Perhaps it's always uncertain, but particular uncertainty in mid-October 2025. The Financial Times today, perhaps the global authority on economics, leads with a story about top American financiers sounding the alarm on lending standards. Jamie Dimon, very influential CEO of JP Morgan, warns about bank collapse. When you see one cockroach, there are probably more. Martin Wolf, the FT's great economic columnist, who's been on this show many times, an old friend of mine, believes that the world economy is in a state of disorder. The real question, though, of course, is what kind of disorder? Jamie Dimon also is in the headlines on lots of fronts. He seems in some ways more in the headlines than most politicians. He announced today or earlier this week a massive $10 billion bet on U.S. national security, sounding more and more indeed like a politician. Maybe he has the power of politicians. Another prominent American industrialist or entrepreneur, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, has got involved with AI investment. He believes that AI investment is crucial for U.S. geopolitical leadership. It all speaks of an increasingly central role for men like Fink and Diamond in the American economy. My guest today is the co-author of an intriguing new book. It's out in December. It's called Capital Evolution. Elizabeth MacBride, Alexandria, Virginia-based writer on economics, wrote it with the Boulder-based venture capitalist Seth Levine. And Elizabeth is joining us today from Alexandria. Congratulations on the new book, Capital Evolution. As I said, it's coming out, Elizabeth, in December 9th. What's your take, before we get into the details of the book, do you agree with Martin Wolf that the world economy is on the verge, or perhaps even in an age of disorder, great uncertainty?
It's a wonderful point, and I love Martin Wolf, and happy to hear that he's a friend of yours. So I would just phrase it differently. I think we're in an age of transition. Disorder is sort of the media's way of making it seem a little bit more alarming than maybe it has to be, but it's definitely a transition.
I always think when people don't know what to make of change, they call it a transition, Elizabeth. What kind of transition?
Well, I mean, what we outline in the book is that we're coming from from our look into history over the past 100 years or so, the world economy runs in cycles. And then they're very connected. The economy is obviously connected to the geopolitical landscape as well. And what we saw is that in our living memory, there's been definitely two previous periods of economic consensus. One was post-World War II, and then one sort of started in the early 1970s with Milton Friedman and shareholder first capitalism. What we believe now is that we're leaving the era of shareholder first capitalism and transitioning into something new.
Interesting, shareholder-centric capitalism. And it was no coincidence that in the introduction, I talked about Jamie Dimon and Larry Fink. I know that you feature both men in your book. Are they examples of this transitional moment? Am I right to suggest that people like Dimon and Fink now have, for better or worse, the power of politicians, maybe more power than politicians, not just in the media, but in fact in what they do? I mean, this CNN headline from a couple of days ago, Jamie Dimon announced his massive $10 billion bet on U.S. national security. It suggests that Wall Street and the federal government in Washington, D.C. are somehow coming together. What's Jamie Dimon investing $10 billion in U.S. national security? I don't want to get too into the weeds on Dimon himself, but do you agree with me that guys like Dimon and Fink, and I know you have other people in the book, but are they examples of these new titans of US capitalism who not only have massive economic but also political power?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the conclusions we came to. And we interviewed Jamie, and I put Larry on the spot. He turned down an actual interview, but I sort of chased him down to the Aspen Ideas Festival and asked him some harder questions from the audience. They both so yes, in fact, the back of our book says business overtook government. Now what? We agree with you that the leaders of these enormous global firms are now more powerful and certainly less accountable than elected leaders, or even you can definitely argue this point because authoritarians obviously have the military at their disposal, but I think they're more powerful than the heads of most states.
Yeah, and of course, America currently, I'm not going to mention his name. I think most people will know who he is, but the current American president is someone who has created a very original and controversial mix of business and politics.
Yeah, actually, we had to obviously revise the book in the 6 months after the election of he who shall not be named. Um, but I came to the conclusion that he's an outgrowth more of business than politics, right? He's a businessman and maybe not a tremendously successful one, but a businessman who figured out how to sort of co-opt the media and the political system to his ends. And that's who he is.
You might have already, Elizabeth, given me a headline for this conversation. Business
Uh-oh.
overtook government. That's the back of the book on capital evolution. Some people might respond to that. The old Marxists will say, well, we knew that. That's always been the case in capitalism. And others will say, well, that's really chilling. And yet I know that your book is not a chilling book. In some ways, it's optimistic. So what's so good about business overtaking government these days?
I mean, you have a control over how you see the world, and I think it ends up being better if you see it through an optimistic lens. So that's a choice on the part of me and my co-author. That's to start with. And the other thing is that I've been a business journalist for 30 years and interviewed many of these titans of industry and worked closely with billionaires. And for the most part, they're decent people. They get a little warped by the amount of money they have, but most of the time they don't want to be living in a world where most people are suffering. So that's one reason
Well,
I
that
think.
kind of jumping in here, Elizabeth, that doesn't say
Go
very
ahead.
much. I mean, one of the other headlines today, Jeff Bezos has suggested that millions of people will be living in space by 2045 and robots will commute on our behalf to the moon. He might mean well, but for most of us don't want to live in space or on the moon. We don't want to commute. And we certainly don't want robots. So the fact that these people might not be evil doesn't necessarily engender a great deal of confidence, does it?
No, you're totally right. And I do think they get deluded, right? I just said that.
To put it
I think
mildly, right?
some of them do. But look, I think that many of these business leaders are actually actively engaged in the process of constructing a new world order that is relatively fair and peaceful. That's in their interest. They need a middle class. They need most people to be prospering and happy, and they're working on it. That's what we found when we interviewed them.
I know your narrative is very much bound up in the history of neoliberalism. We've done lots of shows on the history, the rise and fall of neoliberalism. What for you is that? And we're still living in a neoliberal age, or we're in a post-neoliberal age? And the transition, as you talked in the beginning, is we're going from neoliberalism to something else?
So I think that we're actually in a Frankenstein version of neoliberalism right
Oh,
now.
another headline, Frankenstein version of neoliberalism. You know, there's a new movie out called Frankenstein too.
No, I didn't know that. You're more up on the pop culture. Are you in Great Britain, by the way? Is that where you broadcast from?
No, I broadcast from California, which is the, when you talk about transition, we're transitioning to become the United Kingdom.
I think I might be moving there. Yeah, so yes, Frankenstein version of neoliberalism, right? I think that what's going on now is that the society's sort of been co-opted by what no, I would say the government's been co-opted and turned into a tool for punishing people, right? It's a smaller government. One of the big qualities of neoliberalism has always been smaller government. Government is evil. Government is the enemy. So that narrative was co-opted in and to shape the government into kind of a Frankenstein. And now it's being used to go after political opponents.
Well, that's obviously the current state of the United States. But are you suggesting then that business is the good guy? Or governments become, as you say, co-opted to punish people you don't like, and it's business who will stand up for justice, for fairness?
No, not at all. And in fact, I think that kind of binary thinking is one of the big problems that we have right now. It's just not as simple as that. I think I think most people tend to act in their own self-interest. And I think that capitalism, as we define it in the book, is basically a consensus between society, the people, government, and business. And they all have a role to play. Government is not the enemy. That was a reframing under neoliberalism that I think has not served us very well. And we are arguing for and hoping that we are getting back to a system where business is very powerful, but it still recognizes that it needs government guidelines to make markets work.
I know you've interviewed many people for this book, many living entrepreneurs, as well as Lisa Green Hall, I
Yes.
know, features in the book, who sadly died earlier this year. But in terms of the history of American capitalism, do you have paragons of virtue, models? Carnegie, for example, Henry Ford, sometimes people bring up either as a good guy or an evil guy. Who
Yeah,
for
I know,
you are
right?
models for a responsible, a morally authoritative capitalist, entrepreneur, industrialist in the history of America? Where should we look back for models?
Everybody wants to see heroes or villains. I do think that people can act heroically. And we highlight the story of one who's an unsung hero, actually. He's a guy named Marion Folsom, who was an executive at Kodak in the first half of the 20th century. And when he saw what was happening to people during the Great Depression and in the labor unrest in the 20s, he invented what was called the Rochester Plan, which is basically a social insurance scheme. It didn't work, but he took that idea and kept advocating for it through the Great Depression, ended up working in Republican and Democrat administrations. And today he's remembered, when he's remembered at all, which is not often, um, as the father of Social Security. So I do think there's a role for business leaders to play. I think there's a role for everybody to play. Our particular book is about business leaders and how they can step up and what they can contribute to shaping a new world order.
Yeah, that's an interesting, the Rochester model. I didn't know about that one. I wrote a book a few years ago featuring Kodak, obviously, the post-Rochester model history of Kodak as an interesting one, destroyed really by the internet, had its Kodak moment. Maybe the American economy is now having its Kodak moment. So for you then,
Wait,
Elizabeth.
I'm interested in that. Can I turn the tables and interview you?
Well,
Is
you'll
that
have to we'll do another show and you can interview me. You'll have to read the
okay?
book. Elizabeth, and the book was called The Internet is Not the Answer. I think it came out in about 2014, so it was relatively accurate, I think, in some ways.
Well, we agree on that for sure.
We certainly agree on that. So let's get back to capital evolution. As you say, you touch on some historical models, but it's mostly interviews and analysis of contemporary American entrepreneurs, industrial titans, post-industrial titans. Who for you, if there's one figure in your book, Capital Evolution, that you wrote with Seth Levine, who for you is the model? Who should we really trust? Because the thing about these guys is we don't always trust them. I mean, another example is Sam Altman, very smart,
Mm,
remarkably talented young man, maybe not so young, but certainly not
mm,
old.
mm.
Very controversial figure. He made the announcement today that ChatGPT will soon allow erotica for verified adults. I'm not sure what he
Oh,
said before about ChatGPT, but it's increasingly, it seems, becoming a kind of nightmare. So, who are the models that we should trust? And I think this word trust, Elizabeth, is a key one, isn't it?
well, I agree with you. And I was just thinking actually in the morning as I was going about my routine today that I think the modus operandi for right now, for this moment in history, is trust but verify. I think relationships are much more important in an age when institutions are less important. So I appreciate that question. In terms, I would say we the people we interviewed, there weren't any that I thought were quote bad guys, right? And I think that's one of the points of the book, right? There were some people there that politically I don't agree with. Like we investigated Hobby Lobby, which was behind the court case that meant companies could deny women birth control as part of their health insurance plans. Like that's a stand I really don't agree with, but it's a principled stand on their part, and they're part of the conversation, and they pursued it through legal means. So there are people I would say that are trustworthy, right? They're transparent about what their principles are. You can deal with them. We interviewed people from Patagonia, same thing on the very far left. I think Jamie Dimon is generally trustworthy. I think I've been covering him and have known about him for a long time. I think he can be a very political player, but generally uh, straightforward. Larry Fink, the same, right? I think when they talk about something generally in the public, then it's pretty trustworthy.
Fink, as I said in the introduction, has argued that AI investment is critical for US geopolitical leadership. And of course, he's really talking about China here. But a lot of people are very fearful of AI investment. I don't want to turn this into another AI conversation. What does Larry Fink know about any of that? He might be right about AI investment, but what makes him, shall we say, morally authoritative when it comes to what some people are increasingly seeing as an AI bubble?
Uh, well, I think it's a mistake to see any of these CEOs as morally authoritative, right? Trustworthy is one thing. I think they're decent human beings and therefore reasonably trustworthy. Morally authoritative is different. They are not accountable, which is one of the issues that we raise in the book. And I think the figures that we look to should be accountable in some way, which was one of the strengths of democracy. It does. I hate referring to it in the past tense. I hate that I just made that slip. Democracy does hold leaders accountable, and these business leaders are not accountable. So, should Larry Fink's statements on things that are not particularly related to his area of expertise make headlines? Probably not. But they do, so we're listening to them. They're part of the conversation.
You're not a fan of neoliberalism, and as you said, we're living in a Frankenstein version of neoliberalism now. Is there a degree of nostalgia in capital evolution? Are you suggesting we need to return, perhaps, to a New Deal style economy where the government had more authority over business? Of course, the history of the 30s and indeed of the 40s and 50s and perhaps even the 60s was of government authority over business. Was this
Mhm.
for you an halcyon period, a model period, which we need to return to?
No, not at all. And, that's always the danger of any writing at all. When you put pen to page, even if you're writing about the future, you can only reference the past. And I think since we're human, we tend to be uncomfortable with change. And so we look to the past through rose-colored glasses very often. Um, we tried not to do that. I think it's a danger, but I think the lesson that we want to take from the book is that there are good things and bad things about different eras. Certainly in the post-World War II era, the economic situation was good, right? This is generally agreed upon as the golden age of capitalism. And that there are a lot of reasons for that, but I think one of the reasons is that the people who created that system were coming out of World War II, and that they did understand how bad it could get, right? They wanted to set a world up where there were safeguards from too much inequality, from war. Again, they built a lot of institutions to protect people because that was their mindset. And that idea of protecting people from the worst damages of capitalism and free markets or from political systems, I think that idea is one that is very useful and that we should return to.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did a show last week on that generation coming back from World War II, with David Nassau, who's just written a book about that generation. And he suggests they're not the greatest generation. They're the most damaged generation in the sense that many of them came back profoundly traumatized from the war,
Yeah.
which perhaps explains that more careful, calibrated response to capitalism. So I'm still searching, Elizabeth, for the core of the book, Capital Evolution. I know you talk about something called dynamic capitalism. What does that mean? And is that a theory or a practice? Do you see that on the horizon? What's the heart of the book?
We do see it on the horizon. And it is a book about the near future, right? It's forecasting the near future, which is always a challenging thing to do. But when we interviewed all of these executives, examined the history, and then looked at our current moment, there does seem to be a consensus that's forming. I think the biggest and most important part of that consensus is that people are willing to make long-term sacrifices for the future. What I believe is that climate change and the level of inequality that we're seeing are affecting people in some of the same ways as the great trauma of World War II. It's not the same, but I think people are traumatized right now. We also had COVID, which is again another symptom of a very open world, a world where climate change is doing its damage. And so I think that that is causing people collectively to say, we can invest, we can start institutions, we can rebuild, and we are willing to sacrifice in the short term for that. And there are lots of examples of that. Some we wrote about in the book, and some that have become even more apparent in the past year as in some ways we've deepened, right? But you're also seeing this need or desire for people to want to sacrifice for the long term.
Talk is cheap, though, especially when it comes to these sorts of things, Elizabeth. It's all very well for a Jamie Dimon or a Larry Fink to talk about sacrifice. I'm not sure if they use the S word, but what exactly does that mean? I mean, these business leaders
Yeah.
aren't sacrificing anything.
Yeah.
They
And
can talk about whatever they want. They can talk about sacrificing for the environment, but it seems every time they use the word sacrifice, they become richer and more powerful.
That's fair. And I think, big business leaders are generally motivated by their companies growing and their own personal bottom lines growing first and foremost, right? They don't want to do harm or be living in a world with a lot of suffering, but they are very self-interested people, or they wouldn't be where they are. So I agree with you, but I think that they're very smart at recognizing the underlying trends, and very smart at recognizing that people in general are making this shift. I think it's very striking in Trump supporters who are saying, well, we're personally hurting now, but we're going to give it a little more time. I've just been reporting lately on a town on the Chesapeake called Reedville, where some of the small business owners and the watermen who've been there for a long time, very well aware of the fact that if they lose their last fishing factory, it's going to hurt economically, but also embracing the idea that they're the stewards of the bay and that they do want to maintain it going forward for their children. So that's the thing, right? The media reports all this. Podcasters talk about these things in very confrontational ways. But when you actually go out and report, and I'm an old school reporter, I just talk to people, right? When you talk to people, what you find is that they are in their lives practicing in ways to sacrifice for the long term. So that I think is the real heart of the book. And then there are other ideas that we also think there's a building consensus around. But again, it's not reaching the media. The media has been co-opted by big corporations and is driven by algorithms today. And it is not in the media's interest to report any of this um, building or any of this consensus that's emerging. And so that's what we found. We found this long-term view. We found people who are talking about rebuilding the government guidelines, plenty of very powerful entrepreneurs dedicated to free markets and building their companies. There's the whole B Corp movement. And maybe the biggest thing is that biggest indication, small but telling, is that Dan Schulman, who takes up a whole chapter in our book, and you can write him off any day of the week as like idealistic and, too idealistic and an altruist, who just got named CEO of Verizon. That there is a sea change going on, and it will emerge.
I take your point on Dan Schulman. He, former CEO of PayPal, just got made CEO of Verizon. But I wonder whether Schulman is an example. For you, he's a positive example. But for me, I think he's the reverse. He went to PayPal. Look at the stock of PayPal. It's collapsed over the last 2 or 3 years. I know that he was rather unpopular at PayPal. He left under rather dubious circumstances. As at Verizon, which isn't exactly a model new economy company. Meanwhile, the eBay company that he merged into and then became independent has the reverse stock of PayPal. In other words, when Schulman left, the thing goes up. Schulman seems the kind of guy who, again, coming back to what we've been talking about, he talks the talk. He knows what's to say. But what has Schulman ever done in his life of any value for America or for the broader community?
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, is your only measure for a company or a person's success the stock price over 3 years?
Well, I
mean,
know that there's a great deal of
that's-
misery at PayPal. He made his name at PayPal, and he did a rather poor job there. He left when the stock was really strong, and now it's completely collapsed. And there was certainly a bubble element. I mean, I'm not suggesting that he's a fraudster, but I am suggesting that, and you're not the first author to come along and cite this guy, Dan Schulman. I've always been rather suspicious of him because I just don't see any evidence of him ever doing any good in any way.
Well, I mean, he did reform. We highlighted him in the book because he reformed the pay practices at PayPal, and that was a good thing. I don't see
What
how
do you mean, the
can
pay
say it's not.
practices?
So he came into the company and discovered that. I mean, he told us the story, right? That he was holding a town hall meeting, and as he was researching the questions that people were asking in advance, he discovered that some people at PayPal were not getting paid enough to live on, right? I think this is a fairly,
You mean
I
some
bet,
people who are using PayPal, not people who worked at PayPal?
no, these were people who worked at PayPal. Yeah. And so he then took that to the board of directors and did some more systematic research on what competitors were doing and came up with a new way to pay people at PayPal. In other words, the employees of PayPal. We used it in the book as an example of a CEO who's kind of lost in this neoliberal bubble, right? Who didn't recognize that the market wasn't going to solve these problems. And when he realized that just paying the same as his competitors did not mean paying well or even a living wage. He changed the way the company worked. That, am I going to
Well, I
CEOs
mean,
get,
he would say that, wouldn't he? I mean, he's promoting himself. He worked before American Express. I don't want to make this just about Dan Schulman, but he just strikes me as the kind of slick talking character who talks a good moral game, but actually when you look at his record, it's pretty disastrous and controversial.
Yeah, well, he may be slick. I didn't think he was slick when I interviewed him, but it's
Well, he's
fair.
so slick, you don't even think he's slick when you interview him. I mean,
it's fair.
do we
Yeah.
really want to trust the future of America with maybe not
No,
slick operators,
no,
but cowboys
but
like
that's
Dan Schulman who talk about consensus and helping poor people and become increasingly rich. I mean, the guy's worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah, it's totally fair. But we're not suggesting that we do look to these business leaders as the leaders, right? We're saying that they are very powerful. What does that then mean, right? How do we then create a world to build guidelines about that power at the same time recognizing they're here to stay, right? And we can talk all the time about they are slick or they have too much money. We are all part of the system that has created these men. And now we need to be part of a new
Right. Okay.
system.
I take your point, but then why give someone like Schulman a platform on Capital Evolution? I know he's also blurbing the book. I mean, why promote people like that?
Well, he blurbed the book after we wrote it, and so that didn't have anything to do with the way we wrote it. But why give them a platform? Because they're important. Because he is now, I don't know how many employees Verizon has now, but certainly in the hundreds of thousands. Because we need to be listening to them to understand where they're coming from and where they came from and what they're planning, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I fortunately don't work at Verizon, but the fact that Dan Schulman has shown up at such an old economy style company, which would, if I worked there, would chill me to the bone. I'm sure that
yeah,
in the
really?
next few months we will hear of tens of thousands of Verizon people being laid off for one reason or other. I mean, it just so where's the trust then? Leaving aside Dan Schulman, we've agreed that we can't trust him. Where do we trust? As you say, Elizabeth, that's the core issue, the T word. Where can we look for trust in this new American economy? The subtitle of your book.
What I am hoping is that, and what I actually believe, and we found evidence of this, is that there are new coalitions forming, and old coalitions that are breaking apart. And that's, I think you can trust the outcomes when you start to see that coalitions are producing policies or producing outcomes that are good for the middle class or that do make progress. That's what I would trust. It would be less about the individuals and more about finding a new process that can work, that pulls many people from around America into these coalitions, and then looking at what happens afterwards. That's all that you can trust.
What about the global aspect? Later this week, I'm doing an interview with the former finance minister of Chile, Andres Velasco. He has a new book out, The London Consensus, Economic Principles for the 21st Century. And rather than a US-centric book, it's a global one. How important are other countries for America when it comes to reinventing the new American economy? I mean, as America increasingly competes with China, should America become more or less like China, more or less like Western Europe? And are these international consensuses important?
They are important, but in the United States, you have to recognize everything starts with domestic. That's probably true in every country, but every country is not mine. But in the US, it's all about domestic politics. And I believe that it'll stay that way at least for a bit. So yeah, the U.S. needs to be considering the new international order, and in some ways, right, we can agree with Donald Trump pulling back from some of the obligations abroad because the U.S. has been carrying the world economy on its back for a long time.
What does that
Um,
mean, carrying the world economy on its back?
I
I
mean,
mean,
the American,
it's not
right?
exactly an altruistic
No, for sure not, right?
effort. I
Well,
mean, that's carrying the world economy because it's the strongest the world economy.
right. Absolutely. Right. So yeah, the post World War II order definitely enriched U.S. consumers, but then, and U.S. business leaders and people across the country. But then over that past 100 years, right, the model internally has shifted so that you look at the strength of the U.S. economy, and all of that strength is in the top level, right? You look at the GDP and the stats there, well, they're great, but people are suffering in the United States. And in a lot of ways, it's because the US made a deliberate, I believe it was a deliberate choice, right, to run our economy on debt. Um, and that is exacting a toll now on the middle class. Um, so that's what I mean by carrying the world economy on its back, right? That we were buying we were buying what the world was selling and going into debt to do it. That's untenable, and it's miserable. And so we needed to change that dynamic. So that's a good thing that Donald Trump is doing.
So let's end with some politics. I mean, a lot of what you've been talking about has political implications. As you say, we can't ultimately trust the Jamie Dimons, the Larry Finks, certainly not the Dan Schulmans of the world, although maybe sometimes they say the right thing. The new consensus you're talking about, is it coming from within the Democratic Party? You talked about some innovation or local politics in Chesapeake Bay. Where are these coalitions, and are they political? I mean, how does your new book, Capital Evolution, the New American Economy, how does it gel or not gel with the arguments of people like Ezra Klein in Abundance about getting government back to work and making things happen again?
I mean, I think Ezra Klein is a fine guy. I don't know how much real experience he has. No, that's not fair. I think he was an entrepreneur at some point. But I mean, government's not necessarily the solution. I would say one of the things we didn't write about in the book, which I regret not including, is the fact that the media in the United States has been so caught up in this narrative of the government being the savior. And that's actually an outgrowth of World War II as well. That was part of the ethos of journalism, professional journalism growing up after World War II. Government can act, government can act. Well, government acts in ways that are inefficient and not really great. So limited government is part of what we believe is the best path forward for the United States. Businesses need guidelines, but we don't need an overreaching government. And to answer your question about coalitions, I do think they're coming more from the Democratic, like there's more willingness there to rethink and reshape. You're seeing some of that play out right now in different coalition building exercises across the country. That's because the Democrats lost, right? They are in the mood to change because they need to change. So that's where the change is going to come from.
And what do you make of the shift of the Democrats to the left? I mean, the continuing popularity of Bernie Sanders, AOC, the new quote unquote socialist potential New York City mayor. Is that not a model? Is that the anti-model? Are you warning against that? I mean, business clearly wouldn't be happy with that.
You know, everyone's so freaked out about Mondani. I just think it's New York. New York is always, it's New York. Like, it's not a model for the rest of the country. It's typically an outlier. And it's being held up right now in the media because, like, it's another, it's another like monster to scare people, right? Socialism or here's this left-wing guy coming out. I mean, that is not where the center lies. It's not where the majority of Americans are. It's just New York.
Well, let's end, Lisa. I was going to call you Lisa, Elizabeth, with another character in the book, someone I didn't know much about, Lisa Greenhall. I know you talk about her. She sadly passed away this year. Why should we remember Lisa Greenhall, not just for her life, but her ideas about American capitalism? Tell us a little bit about who she was and why you included her in the book.
Yeah, well, she was sort of a Marian Folsom figure, but much more recent. Another kind of unsung hero working at the very heart of the cooperation between the public and private sectors starting in the 1990s. She was a banker in New York, getting money to low-income communities in New York, and then eventually moved into the federal government, was an advisor to Bill Clinton, creating some of the economic structures that are still doing some good today, although they're being taken down now. But I included her, and she was a friend of mine, and also a mentor. We met when I was working at Georgetown. I included her because she really articulated very well the fact that We want to separate business leaders. We want to cast them in a mold, right? We want to say that if you're a manager or an executive at a big company, you're only interested in profits, or you're only this or that. You kept pressing me about this all day today, right? Somebody's a hero or a villain, one or the other. And she articulates very well for us in the book that, in fact, you can't separate people from the complexity of their emotions and their values and their principles, and that they generally act in those complex ways. So capital evolution is really recognizing that and figuring out that for a complex world, we need complex coalitions and we need to recognize the nuance.
Good stuff. Capital Evolution, The New American Economy. It's written by Seth Levine and Elizabeth MacBride. It's out in the first week of December. I think I'll get Seth Levine on the show in December to talk more about the book. Real honor, Elizabeth, to have you on the show and for dealing with my obnoxious questions. We'll get you back on the show to talk more economics, more capital evolution.
And your book about Kodak.
Yeah, maybe you can interview me about my book, The Internet's Not the Answer. Thank you so much, Elizabeth MacBride.